Gentleman from California, Mr. Martinez.
I yield the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller, 3 minutes.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
I was going to consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. There's no doubt that we should do everything we can to discourage the sale and use of drugs by our nation's youth. But we do the youth of our nation a disservice by suggesting that they are alone and responsible for the nation's drug problem. And we do them even a greater disservice by coming to the floor with an empty political gesture that plays to the worst stereotype of young people, while at the same time the Republican leadership of this Congress refuses to lift a finger on behalf of this nation's youth. Today, the Congress will make a simplistic statement about a very complex problem. It will scapegoat our nation's young people for the problem for which they, in reality, we all should be taking responsibility for. It's not a question of the America's public's commitment to the war against drugs, to the parents of our young children's commitment to the war against drugs. It's the problem of a very tired, outdated, and ineffective war on drugs. But let me also point out what this resolution and this Congress will fail to do. It will fail to reward the vast majority of youth who stay out of trouble, in many cases overcoming great obstacles, such as poverty or difficult family circumstances. It will fail to promise American youth an improved conditions in their schools, conditions which adults would never tolerate in their own workplaces. It will fail to tell America's youth that we want them to share in the benefits of a boom economy and unprecedented prosperity by expanding their educational and economic opportunities. It will fail to promise them the protection of being victims of violence and abuse, either at the hands of their peers, in their own families, or someone much older than themselves. It will fail to provide for after-school programs to make productive use of the time that young people have in the late afternoons. The number one complaint among young people is there's nothing to do, and yet we see music programs, arts programs, educational programs all scaled back. No alternatives. No alternatives to people just hanging out. And it will fail to announce a commitment of stopping tobacco companies from preying on young people by aggressively marketing their product that will ultimately kill more than every illegal drug combined. Instead, the most affluent generation of elders in this nation's history will scold its youth and tell them that they are bad and shirk its responsibility for making things better. It's easy to bash teens, and while we shouldn't minimize the very real problem of drug use by Americans' young people, let's make sure that the record is straight about the entire drug problem. Teenagers account for less than 1% of illegal drug deaths. The adult drug death rate is nearly 10 times higher than that of adolescents. While the use of illegal drugs by young people actually decreased between 79 and 94, for adults over the age of 35 it increased by 28%. The top 3 causes of death among youth are automobile accidents, homicides, and suicides. The drug that is the factor in most of those car crashes is alcohol, but it's not addressed in this resolution. In fact, just a few weeks ago, we saw the leadership cave to
Time has expired.
unanimous consent for 1 additional minute.
I yield the gentleman 1 additional minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 additional minute.
In fact, just a few short weeks ago, we saw the leadership cave to the alcohol lobby, and we're not allowed to have an amendment voted on by Representative Lowy to toughen laws against drunk driving. I will vote for this measure, as I expect all members will, because I agree with most of what it says. But the things that it does not say and the things that it fails to do to provide hope and opportunity for this nation's young people say more about where we are as a nation and falling short on our responsibilities to our nation's youth. And finally, I'd like to say that Congressman Paul has raised a whole series of questions that this Congress is afraid to debate. Ask the American people the next time you're in a town hall if they believe that the war on drugs is working. Tell them we've spent $200 billion. It may be the least effective program we have on the nation's books. There's no other market in the world where you'd spend $200 billion interfering with the market and the price of drugs on the street would never change over a 2-decade period of time. That is a testimony. The market every day turns in a report on the war on drugs, and the market says the cost of doing business hasn't gone up 1 scintilla. And we ought to start thinking about new tools and a new approach, and we ought to stop pretending like this is only a problem for young people in this country.
What purpose does the gentleman from Indiana rise?
I appreciate the past gentleman from California's support for this measure. I yield 2 minutes to Mr. Hutchinson of Arkansas, who's been a leader in the anti-drug effort.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Speaker. I rise in strong support of this resolution, which simply expresses a sense of Congress that we as Americans must remain committed to the war on drugs. Now, I want to commend my friend from New Jersey, Mr. Pappas, who's done an excellent job in leading this fight, and also my friend from Texas who has spoken against this resolution, and I want to address a couple of concerns that he has raised. He says that this resolution is an endorsement of the status quo. It is just the contrary. It is saying that the status quo is unacceptable. The present situation where we have teenage drug use soaring is not acceptable. We have to get off the dime. We as a country have to do something and remain committed. The gentleman from California that just spoke, he started pointing fingers and being critical of this. Well, the status quo is whenever we take $1 billion away from our efforts for interdiction, whenever federal drug prosecutions fall 12% since 1992. Whenever the DEA agents are cut, how can you fight a war on drugs when you're cutting those type of resources? That's the status quo, and we need leadership, and we need to go in a different direction. And this resolution says we welcome new ideas. We want a different approach. We want to do more, and we as a nation must be committed, and that's the direction that we need to go. The argument is, well, we do not want to federalize all law enforcement, make this a federal issue. Well, certainly we need to fight this community to community. I've been in Gentry, of a town of 1,000 in Arkansas. I'm going to Waldron, a town of 400 in Arkansas. And we are talking about what we can do as a community, fighting this war community by community. But there is a federal role. And the argument is, well, the Constitution does not allow this. But the Constitution says that the United States government must protect ourselves, and it's a responsibility from enemies, foreign and domestic. And this is an enemy that affects our national security, and it is a very appropriate role for our federal government to be involved in this battle. Both the federal government, the communities, we have a job to do. We must do it together. We must work together, both Democrats, Republicans, Independents, all fighting together to win this. I ask your support for this resolution.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me point out once again that up until just very recently in our history, it was assumed that the federal government did not have this authority. To assume that we do have this, I guess that's why we call it a war, to say that this is national defense. But prohibition, obviously, when they passed that amendment to the Constitution, recognized that the Congress couldn't pass laws. And like I mentioned, in 1937, when Roosevelt decided that we should attack medical marijuana, that he would do it through raising taxes. So it's only in recent history that we've decided that this is a federal project. And the record is just not very clear that it's been very successful. But I am concerned not only about the drug usage, obviously, but also the fact that the war has failed, but those things that are so negative when it comes to violation of liberties. The other day there was a story in the media that said there was a child suffering from an acute attack of asthma. Now there was another asthmatic in the class, and she did what seemed to come natural to her. She went and gave her a whiff of her nebulizer, and the girl immediately came out of her acute asthma attack. And she was quickly apprehended under a federal statute saying that she was disobeying the federal law on the use of drugs. Now, it might be advisable to caution a young child given medications to another, but this was very obvious and very clear. She happened to have been a hero with the other students, and she was certainly a hero for the girl she helped.
Gentleman's time has expired.